Now, the question in the title may seem, on the face of it, kind of absurd. I mean, the Metropolitan line is not only an underground line, but it's the original underground line. The thing is, I think there's a very real possibility that had things gone just a little differently, we might have a totally different tube map today. Now, I'll admit that a lot of what I'm about to say is speculative, but let me explain my reasoning. On the 10th of January 1863, the Metropolitan line opened from Paddington to Farringdon, or rather the Metropolitan Railway did. In those days it was an independent company. The concept of the London Underground did not exist. Those first trains were owned by a different company, the Great Western Railway. The GWR was one of the largest rail companies in the country and had their London headquarters at Paddington. They had contributed £175,000 towards the construction of the line and agreed to work the railway, even constructing a new class of locomotive, the Metropolitan tanks, especially for the route. Yet less than 8 months later, the GWR would withdraw their trains and leave the Metropolitan to fend for itself. What happened? Well, a couple of things. One, the two companies disagreed on how many services they should provide. The line was popular, and the Met felt that if the GWR wouldn't run more trains, they were throwing money away. The GWR argued that they couldn't safely run any more. But the second reason is what's interesting here. You see, the Metropolitan wanted to extend to Moorgate Street in the city, as well as add extra tracks to their existing lines. And they approached the GWR about contributing financially. This was a fairly standard arrangement. Big companies contributed towards smaller companies' construction costs as a way of guaranteeing the right to run trains over the new line. The Metropolitan was a useful link between the big London terminal stations and the heart of the city, so other companies were certainly interested in getting in on the ground floor, or rather below it. But this time the GWR wanted more. They wanted a stake in the company. They wanted stock. I mean, not rolling stock, the other kind of stock. And that was rather more than the Metropolitan were willing to give them. So the GWR stomped out in a huff. By which I mean they took their coaches and their brand new engines and abandoned their subterranean friends. The Great Northern Railway stepped in to help, but the Metropolitan had learned a hard lesson about relying on other companies and bought their own rolling stock. They would remain independent all the way up to 1933, when they officially became part of the London Underground. So what was the idea behind the GWR's demand? As I see it, there are two possibilities. One, the success of the Metropolitan took them by surprise, and they wanted in. Or two, they wanted to take over. As far as I'm aware, there's no evidence favouring either explanation, but I'd like to explore the second. Did the Great Western have a motive to take the Metropolitan over? Absolutely. It was a lucrative route, and it would give them something they didn't currently have. A line into the biggest business district in the world. As I said, their terminus was at Paddington, and at the time that was considered to be basically out in the suburbs. The city, that is the capital C city, was where it was at. Goods depots, offices, shops, markets, industries, places with an insatiable appetite for trains. And the Metropolitan also had connections to other railways via those terminal stations that I mentioned earlier, which the GWR could certainly use. Would they have done so? I think it's fair to say, absolutely yes. It was fairly standard practice among railways in the 19th century. Small companies were bought out by big ones, whether they liked it or not. The GWR didn't become one of the biggest railways in Britain by laying a lot of track, you know. So what would have happened if they did? Well, most obviously, the Metropolitan wouldn't be an underground line. It would be a branch of the Great Western. Likely that would mean that your train from Baker Street or Farringdon would travel much further afield. You can get the Elizabeth line from Liverpool Street to Reading now, but had the GWR got their way, you likely would have been able to do that back in the 1860s. If Reading's not far enough, how about Oxford, or Exeter, or Birmingham? So that's cool, but what about the rest of the Underground? Well, I think we would still have the Hammersmith and City line. because despite the animosity between the Metropolitan and the GWR, the Hammersmith and City was a joint venture between them. It opened in June 1864, so it was under construction while they were arguing. I doubt the GWR would have seen any reason to cancel it. And there's another factor at play here. Hammersmith was served by the GWR's rivals, the London and South Western Railway. The GWR never missed an opportunity to muscle in on the LSWR's turf. The district started out with the intention of turning the Metropolitan Railway into a circular route, or circle line, if you will. It was created as an independent company for financial purposes, planned to be absorbed into the Metropolitan once the line was complete. It didn't work out that way, and following a number of disputes, it stayed independent. The history of railways in the 19th century is basically a history of arguments. But if the GWR had owned the Met, I think it's likely that they would either have abandoned the project, or they would have done it themselves. If they did it themselves, the chances are that the Circle Line would have been built a lot quicker, because the GWR had a lot more money than the district. The district's lack of money was also what encouraged them to extend west into the suburbs. It's debatable whether the GWR would have done the same. They had plenty of lines in West London and already had stations at Ealing Broadway and Uxbridge before the Underground got there. If they had gone to Wimbledon and Richmond, they would certainly not have followed the same routes, because both of the current Underground lines run over track that used to belong to the London and South Western Railway. There was no way those two were going to play nice. In real life, the district was bought out by a syndicate led by shady American businessman Charles Tyson Yerkes in 1901. He bought out a number of other incipient tube lines and mashed them all together to form Underground Electric Railways of London. Had the district line been owned by the GWR, of course, that would have been rather more difficult, if not impossible. He wouldn't have been contending with an impoverished small company, but a huge rail traction behemoth. He might well have put in a bid to electrify the lines, because that's how he started out with the district line, but I suspect that the GWR would have kept him on a tight leash. With the Metropolitan and Hammersmith and City being a part of the GWR, and the district and circle either not existing or also being part of the GWR would own nearly all the subsurface tube lines. The only one they wouldn't have would be the East London line, although in real life both the Metropolitan and the district were among the companies that had shares in the East London Railway. I see no reason why the GWR wouldn't want to get involved in that line, with it being a key route in London. And in that case, they would likely have extended the Metropolitan line to Whitechapel to meet up with it. And here we come to another of my own personal theories. Underground lines are divided into two basic types. You have your deep-level lines, which are constructed in tunnels far below ground. They have smaller trains. They feel very distinctive. And then you have your subsurface lines, which really don't feel very different from ordinary trains. My theory is that the only reason we think of subsurface lines as underground lines is because Underground Electric Railways of London took the district over. Before that, it and the Metropolitan Railway were considered to be ordinary railways that just happened to have a section under the ground. If the GWR was in charge, then I suspect that none of the subsurface lines would have been absorbed into the underground in 1933. In which case, what would we have today? It's possible that the District, Circle, Hammersmith and City and Metropolitan lines would today be part of the Overground, or perhaps something different altogether. The rest of the underground would be a bit more consistent, but of course, just a little bit more. At least, the tube map might be a little bit less crowded. Well, I hope you enjoyed this speculative tale from the tube. As I say, this is just me playing with ideas. I don't know for sure if the GWR had any plans along these lines, haha, so to speak, or how they might have played out. But it's fun to imagine. If you did enjoy this, then please do leave a like and perhaps subscribe for more. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon and here on YouTube for your support. You are the GWR shares in my Metropolitan Railway. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.